welcome to DIY with Nancy. Hope you're all doing well. Today I'm going to make my recipe for palmiers. Palmiers is traditionally known as a French pastry. It's made out of puff pastry. It's actually layers of puff pastry combined together with some sugar. And it seems a little difficult to make, but really it's extremely easy. And today I'm going to show you how I make palmiers step by step. So stay with me and let's get to baking.
Here are the ingredients you'll need to make the palmiers. Here I have salt, granulated sugar, and of course you'll need a puff pastry dough. Now this one is a pre-made one. If you like to know how to make homemade puff pastry, you can go to my pastéis nata recipe. Now of course I'll list the quantity of the ingredients as we go along. Let's get started. I'm going to set aside the puff pastry and get started with my first two ingredients. I have 1 cup of granulated sugar and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, which I'm placing into the sugar. And I'm going to simply mix it together. I have the sugar and salt well combined. I'm going to use my counter as the working surface, but if you like, you can also use a large cutting board. I'm simply going to place the sugar and salt onto my working surface, just as I'm doing here. Now I'm placing my puff pastry sheet onto the sugar and salt, so I want to make sure there's an even mixture onto the counter so it's well coated underneath. Okay, now I'm ready to work with the puff pastry sheet. I'm gently unfolding the sheet from the paper. I'm going to flatten it in the edges. You can see it curls up. I'm just going to flatten it, and I'm going to flip it over onto the sugar mixture on my working surface, just like that. Before removing the paper from the puff pastry, I'm gently tapping the puff pastry onto the sugar mixture and then gently removing the paper. Now I'm going to drizzle the sugar mixture onto the puff pastry sheet. Now I want to ensure that my puff pastry sheet is completely coated with sugar. Now here's a close-up of the sugar onto the puff pastry sheet. You can see it's evenly coated. Now at this point, you want to ensure that your oven's preheated at 425 degrees Fahrenheit. For the next step, I'll be using my rolling pin to gently press the sugar onto the puff pastry. Now as I'm doing this process, I'll be also stretching out the puff pastry sheet. So I'll have an overall size of a 10 by 14 inch sheet. You can see it's very delicate, so as you're pressing it, you'll be stretching the puff pastry sheet, just like that. Now don't worry if the edges are not perfect. It doesn't have to be a complete square or circle if you're using a round puff pastry sheet, but I'm going to be rolling it twice, or pressing it twice, just as I'm doing here. Now I'm ready to create the layers of a puff pastry. I'm going to do that by folding in the edges about 2 to 2.5 inches in. And I'm going to use my pastry dough scraper to help me remove the puff pastry from my surface. I just want to make sure my puff pastry doesn't tear. So I'm going to gently tap it in, just as I'm doing here. I'm going to do that on both sides. And now I'm going to fold it in about 2 to 2.5 inches in. And I'm going to do that on both sides, just as I'm doing here. I'll fold the other side. So that's about 2 to 2.5 inches in. I want to make sure that both sides are about even. And then what I'm going to do again is just place some sugar on the bottom portion that I just folded in. So I want to make sure that the puff pastry is evenly coated, and then I tap it, just make sure it's glued together. Now I'm going to do the same thing and fold it into the middle on both sides, again using my pastry scraper. Now I'm ready to create another layer. So I'm going to fold one edge to the middle, and I just want to make sure I'm going to give it enough space for the other side. So you can play with it, but If you could see, all I'm doing is want to place it right in the center and then fold the other side to the center. I don't want to overlap it. I just want to make sure they're evenly lined up right to the middle. So I'm going to gently tap it. And once again, I'm going to coat the puff pastry sheet that I just flipped over with some sugar once again. And once I do that, I'm just going to roll it, and you don't want to press it down, just roll the sugar into the puff pastry. So I'm just pressing the sugar into the puff pastry, and I'm going to do that twice. And once again, I'm going to use the pastry scraper just to remove the pastry on both sides from the surface, make sure they're not stuck. And this just avoids me from tearing the puff pastry. And I'm going to fold it over the last layer. You'll end up with 6 layers of puff pastry. Now again, I want to coat the layer that I flipped over with sugar just on top, just like that. Just an even little coat. I'm going to take the rolling pin and gently roll the sugar onto the puff pastry one last time. Now you can see that the edges of my puff pastry are not even. All I'm going to simply do is take a pizza cutter and just cut the edges just like that. I'm going to do the same thing to the other side. For the next step, I'm going to cut or slice the puff pastry, and I'm using my index finger to determine the width of my puff pastry slices. So I'm going to use my index finger all the way through and use a pizza cutter to cut the puff pastry. I have all the puff pastry slices cut, and I want to show you the layers of the puff pastry. There we go. We have the sugar in between there, and that's how we make the layers of puff pastry for the Palmiers. For the next step, I have a large baking tray with parchment paper, and I'm going to start lining the slices of puff pastry with the cut side up, lined up 2 to 3 inches apart. Very important, you want to give that distance between the puff pastry because the puff pastry will expand in the oven. As I'm lining the puff pastry slices on the baking sheet, I just press firmly down so that way it can hold ground and it doesn't fall over once the puff pastry expands in the oven. Now another tip is if you don't have a large baking tray, you might have to use 2 smaller baking trays just to give the puff pastry enough space to expand in the oven. Now I'm ready to place the puff pastry in the oven and bake it at 425 degrees for 8 minutes. And once the 8 minutes are up, I'm going to flip them over and I'm going to bake them for an additional 5 minutes. You want to make sure you get a caramelized color on both sides. Palmiers have been baking for 8 minutes on one side, and I'm now flipping them over to the other side. And you want to make sure you're very careful because these are extremely hot, and I'm just using here a tongue to flip them over on the other side. And once they all flipped over, I'm going to be baking them for an additional 5 minutes. The Palmiers are out of the oven, and look at this. You have a nice golden color. The sugar caramelizes the Palmiers. They're nice and crispy. Can't wait to dig into one of these. Now here is a Palmier which I'm going to break into. I just want you to see. Look at that. The flakiness. It's nice and flaky, buttery on the inside, crispy. The flakiness in this Palmier is absolutely delicious.
Okay everyone, that's how I make homemade Palmiers. As you can see, they're actually very simple to make. The flakiness on the puff pastry and the Palmier, and when you bite into it, so great. And like I said, they're easy to make. Now this puff pastry that I used today was purchased at a store, local store. You can find it in the freezer section. And you can also make your own homemade puff pastry. And if you want to see how to make homemade puff pastry, you can go to my recipe for pastéis de nata custard tarts on DIY with Nancy. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope you all enjoy the recipe, and if you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, everyone, thanks so much for watching.